Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Youth Day. Thank you so much for making the time to join us this afternoon. As you all know, this year, 2026, marks the 50th year since the 1976 Youth Uprising in Soweto. And on this morning, 50 years ago, thousands of students marched toward Orlando Stadium in Soweto to protest against the Bantu education system and the enforced use of Afrikaans. What was meant to be a peaceful protest was met with fierce police brutality. The armed police fired tear gas and live ammunition into the crowds, and many young people lost their lives that day, including Hector Peterson, a 12-year-old schoolboy whose death, captured by Sam Nzima, became a global symbol of the anti-apartheid struggle. This event profoundly changed the socio-political landscape in South Africa, locally and internationally. It was the catalyst that renewed anti-apartheid resistance both domestically and internationally. But this uprising is not only an important point in South African history, but it's also a reminder that the youth have what it takes and the power that it takes to change Africa. I mean, in Africa, we have the youngest population with the median age being just 19 years old. I think about that quote by Frantz Fanon that says that each generation must discover its mission and fulfill it, considering the unique crisis it confronts. 50 years ago, it was the crisis of apartheid and the end of white domination in South Africa. And for our generation, this crisis takes the form of a more existential threat, a changing climate. And so, as the title of this webinar suggests, the next youth struggle is the climate justice struggle, because young people will inherit the long-term consequences of a warming planet. The climate justice movement has become the defining generational struggle. It's no longer just about nature conservation, but it's an intersectional fight connecting environmental justice with human rights, economic justice, and social justice. The crisis of today is on a scalar level and connects at multiple points. But youth today are also facing a challenging reality that's marked by doomerism and a media landscape that's dominated by constant bad news and misinformation. And this constant dwelling on terrible events often encourages a pessimistic outlook, distorting young people's perceptions for life and limiting their expectations for the future. A Polcast study found that Gen Z was viewed as the generation most likely to lead on climate, but is now showing signs of fatigue and disillusionment. And this stems from growing distrust in institutions and an increasing sense of helplessness. We know that youth are underrepresented in government and leadership. And more than this, we know that the governments do not understand or refuse to acknowledge the gravity of the climate crisis. However, the uprising in 1976 was a watershed moment, and the dreams and desires of those young people still remind us of how much further we have to go to emancipate the country. In recent times, this has led us to confront the reality that worsening climate shocks will lead to internal displacement across the country, with refugees looking for safety. Migration, climate apartheid, and injustice are seriously connected. And in light of today, a super El Niño is rising in the Pacific and is likely to have devastating impacts on our region. Our food and water systems are going to be seriously challenged. And instead of xenophobia, we need unity for climate justice for all Africans. We need each other to survive the worsening climate crisis. And so Pan-African and planetary solidarity for climate justice is our only response. And so the climate justice charter movement, through its plurivision, is grounded on principles and practices of democracy that seek to address the legacies of apartheid, address the crisis of today, and the work of building a just and livable future. And so today we are bringing to the fore some of our leading climate justice voices in the country under the theme, The Next Youth Struggle is a Climate Justice Struggle. Today, we're joined by distinguished Professor Colleen Vogel, who is one of Wits University's leading climate scientists, who is part of an IPCC team that won a Nobel Prize for their climate work. Her research focuses on climate change, climate vulnerability, and adaptation, with a particular focus on disaster risk reduction and climate variability. She was one of the key contributors to writing the Green and White Papers on South Africa's disaster management, and was also a major contributing author for the Disaster Management Act. Alongside this, she's passionate about youth development and is involved in mentoring students to help advance both theory and practice in various research projects. Chelsea Bane is program manager at COPAC and sits on the National Convening Committee of the Climate Justice Charter Movement. Kawekazi Mahlalela is a community activist and the national coordinator of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Both Kawe and Charles are some of the most consistent, research-focused, and dynamic grassroots climate justice activists. They're thinking through systemic alternatives to survive the worsening climate crisis. And so we're so grateful that the three of you could join us today to share your insights around this topic. Colleen will be sharing about the El Niño. Kawe will help us understand the risks posed to our food system and the need to strengthen food sovereignty pathways. And then Charles will help us understand what it looks like to build a climate emergency policy platform that takes seriously the climate crisis of our time. And so, how the webinar today will be structured is that each of our speakers and our panelists will present on their topics, and then we'll open up the floor afterwards for some questions and further engagements. Colleen, you're welcome to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Um, can I just make sure that I have got sharing capability? Thanks. Okay,
There we go.
thank you. I hope you can see my screen. Is it coming through?
Not yet.
Ooh, okay, let's try again. Now, is it coming through?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, and I'll put it on from slide mode, slideshow, play from the start. Okay, thanks all. Is it okay to go?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be part of this panel. I'm passionate about working with the youth. We've done a lot of work with the youth in the city of Johannesburg, and we continue to do so. So a couple of stark headlines just to wake us up on a Tuesday, where many of us might have been having more of a peaceful day. Southern Africa is projected to become systematically drier and drastically warmer. These are messages with a climate change focus, and you can see the sources there. I work with the Global Change Institute. And just to correct the introduction, I'm no longer a distinguished professor, but well, maybe not so old, but an emeritus retired professor, but still passionate about this work. So the climate change message is a bit of a dire one for the area and for the country and the region, characterized in particular by scenarios of multi-year droughts, which could be and have known to be problematic when we look at the intersectionality of water, food, and other issues, particularly for livelihoods of those who live in the cities in poorer areas, as well as those living in rural conditions and situations. So I won't dwell too much on the water and food security issues as such in this presentation, because I thought one of the things that is really needed is for the youth, for all of us, to have more of an active agency where we have much better understanding of the information that we need, the evidence base to bring from the science into the various platforms, into the various rooms and, if you like, round the table where we are invited to talk, so that we're not just waving our arms, but actually have some kind of information that is located and anchored in some of the science. So I'll go and give a little bit of that, and then hopefully not too much of a lecture. So the thing that I want to share today is what is known as the El Niño, or the Southern Oscillation. And essentially, this science is a very complicated science, as is many of our sciences. But this is a science that tries to look at the linkages of the processes that are involved in the oceans, that are involved on the land, and that are involved in generating weather and climate, which is, if you like, the atmosphere. And these things, these, if you like, three domains or areas of action are all interlinked. And so as you'll see in the presentation as I go along, the role of watching what's happening in the ocean is really key. And it's really sad and, in fact, tragic that there looks as if there are attempts to stop that observation. And we really need to be equipped to take on and ask and demand, if you like, for those observations to be put back into place. Because if we don't have those, we struggle to make the kind of forecasts that we need to be prepared. So the atmosphere and the ocean then, as you can see, are coupled. And there are a lot of things going on. The scientists who do this research are looking at water vapor. They're looking at, as the ocean heats up, how does it warm up the atmosphere? How do clouds develop? But that also then affects the pressure systems. And so you've got to look at that. That then drives winds. And then also, as you go diving into the ocean as such, you've got a whole lot of things going on there which influence what's happening in the ocean. Things like salinity, thermocline, and so on. But we do have these abilities to use that complicated system. And the more we understand it, we can configure and start to look at forecasting, in particular long range forecasting, which is essentially around 30 days up to about 2 years. And so we look at monthly forecasts and seasonal forecasts. But then we can even go beyond that into the climate change, if you like, arena, which takes us into decades going forward. So we need to be clear in our heads what we're trying to talk about here. And El Nino normally falls within the repertoire of the seasonal climate forecasts, those who are working in the next few days, the next months going forward. So it's a very interesting area to work in. And we need to look at the links between El Nino and climate change, but that is obviously something that requires a lot more explanation. And I'm just going to give you glimmers of it today. So we've got great progress that has been made, and we've got to fight for that progress to be maintained as youth, particularly for the next generation, enabling us to monitor and predict and to show where frontal movement will happen, where winds might shift and change, like in El Nino, and what that'll do to systems and to the world at large. Unfortunately, the day-to-day fluctuations in weather are not that good in terms of, especially when you go beyond 2 weeks. So you've got errors, you've got to do validation, you've got to do issues of testing the system, but you still have a fairly good sense of what's going to happen in the next season. And that's why you can see some of the social media, which is ramping up to tell us that the Godzilla of El Niños is about to hit us, or in fact, some people say has already occurred. There is some skill, though. We're very concerned as scientists about how much skill we have in predicting or projecting the changes that occur. And so what we try and work on is particularly understanding anomalies. In other words, variations from means or positionality, if you like, of the system where it's changing from what it normally does. And that's where the El Nino comes in. There you can see a picture that shows you these red tongues, these changes in sea surface temperature that we have to monitor very, very carefully, and that we can start to develop and monitor slowly over time so that we get a better picture of, if you like, what is coming down the track. So briefly, what is El Nino? It's related to surface ocean temperatures that occur in particular in the Eastern and Central Pacific. It gets its name not from Ronaldinho. One of my family members thought it was named after soccer players, but even though we're in the soccer season, it's actually named after the time of the year when these things occur, the Christ child. It develops every 2 to 7 years, and it can last for 9 to 12 months. So you can see the time scale is much, much more, if you like, accessible in terms of the forecast. But it operates in phases, and the normal phase, when things are normally happening, is when you have these easterly winds that blow across the Pacific area, piling up warm water in the areas of Asia and Australia. And that wind blowing across that Pacific area actually pulls up deep ocean currents, which often have very rich sources for fish, etc. So like we have off the coast of our own country in the western portions of the country. But when they reverse, when those big circulatory winds start to reverse, then the system changes and things start to, if you like, collapse. But not only that, storm and rainfall patterns actually shift. And we've had a number of these, and I'll show you this graphically in a minute. But just to put on the kind of notice board, if you like, the eye that we have to keep on is the next one coming. We've had some in 23 El Nino years going back all the way to 1877, in fact. But there are some of them that we've had. The one of 97, 1998 was expected to be big. but it didn't really have that massive impact as we were expecting, largely because of what was happening in the Indian Ocean. So these patterns are there. They're not always exactly the same, which makes it interesting for scientists, but tough for people who have to experience them. And so there's a diagram, and you can find lots of lovely ones on Google and on the internet. So I'm not going to belabor this too much, but essentially just to say that middle panel shows you the normal year, what's happening normally. So you can see the bottom black arrow going across the Pacific area there, dragging the water across, piling it up, piling up warmer water onto that Asian side, Australian side, which then acts as a pump into the atmosphere and generates these big clouds. And for us, that's when it's okay for us. La Nina is actually even better for us. We can have wetter conditions. But El Nino, when that system starts to break down and the warm water starts to slosh off, if you like, flow back towards where it was being pumped up from, if you like, the upwelling that I was talking about off the coast of South Africa, that's when the clouds then shift into the middle of the Pacific. And that's not really as helpful to us as it would be if it was a normal or if it was a wetter period. So there you get the system in a little box diagram. And I think it's a nice one to have in mind because it's a complicated system. It's driven by temperatures on the warm ocean surface, but it's also coupled by what's churning down underneath in terms of the thermocline, etc. And so some people say, well, what causes these winds to collapse? Well, it's this whole circulation system, but what triggers that? Well, that's a point of major concern for scientists as we start to look at climate change and then also look at other circulation systems that may have an influence, like in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean. So you can see the areas that get impacted. And when we have El Nino, you can see it's usually dry over much of Southern Africa and wet in parts towards the east. But you can see other parts of the world in that tropical band start to have similar, if you like, sets of imprints or the fingerprint of El Nino. So you have wet and dry. And then when it goes into the La Nina phase, those things swap around and you tend to get wetter conditions where you previously had drier conditions. But you might be asking yourself, how do you really monitor this thing? And so it's a phenomena that is developed and monitored using an index created with data and information coming from Darwin and Tahiti. That develops into a very nice, interesting index that you can track and monitor. And you can see the phases where it was above, the droughts that were occurring, 82, 83, 87, 88, 91, 92, 97, and now we've got the Godzilla coming. So we've got a complicated system and a way of tracking this. And so all eyes are focused on this, if you like, development that is happening while we speak. But El Nino and La Nina are not the only things that influence our rainfall in South Africa. And we need to be very careful about saying, oh, everything is driven, all droughts are driven by El Nino. That's not true. There's obviously things that are happening in the Indian Ocean, things that are happening to the west of us in the Western Cape. We've had a very wet season in the previous summer season. How did that fit into the whole equation? And will our impacts with an El Nino be as severe? Maybe we will have those offset by that wetter period that we've just come through in the past summer. And that's why we've got to do the general circulation studies, the big modeling that goes way forward, looks way down the train tracks, if you like, and then also the immediate thing that is happening as El Nino, if you like, moves into the station for action. But as I come to the end, the hazard of climate change isn't the only thing that we should be focusing on. And this is where I think the youth and all of us as citizens can play such a major role, because it's the science that needs to come into the room, but also it's the science that exposes what is happening underneath the system. So if you look here, you can see climate change interacts with other things that are happening in our world. So on the top of that diagram, you can see exposure to hazard. So there's El Nino, if you like, sitting in the diagram. But what El Nino does, it exposes all the things that should be in place to help us better handle that. So things like access to health services that function and work well, credit, information, early warning. And then what about income, people's incomes, parity, equity, assets, etc., etc. And it's only when we look at this as an entire bundle or a system that we can really start to build the capacity to reduce the impacts of El Nino. And that's where I work with a lot of young colleagues, both in the department and in the city. We've now got interns working in the city, trying to also help the city to get a better, if you like, gaze onto this El Nino situation. So as I conclude, if you're wanting to Google a bit more, the El Nino, the science of it is complicated. It's located more in the near term when you look at it as a forecaster in terms of the long climate change, 30, 40, 50-year out, if you like, time scale. So it's a very interesting period to study, and Willem Landman, who kindly assisted me with some of these slides based at the University of Pretoria, is one of the gurus, if you like, in terms of studying the dynamics of the El Nino, and Francois Engelbrecht and others, Jessica Steinkopf at the GCI, are also doing work in this area. But there you can see a nice summary. Climate normally occurs with an event, a process, and that's El Nino, the jagged, if you like, yellow arrow. That then stresses or occurs on an exposure unit, which could be a fishing community, a city community, a rural community, a landscape, a farming community, etc. And it produces outcomes. It produces, if you like, impacts. But what we need to do, and what we've been doing for a long, long time, is moving into what is called the adaptation space, because we don't want to just cope with this from time to time. We want to get stronger in the face of these changes. And that's where we have to look at the exposure unit being impacted by other things, which is where those of you who are in the political sciences can help, the anthropology, the economics of it, because what is making that system weak in the first place? So if I could use an analogy or a real world case, if you like, climate coming, El Nino coming, impacting on South Africa, going to maybe be hotter than normal if it kicks in severely. That could have impacts on food supply, etc., etc. But food's already going up. Food prices are already increasing. We're already being stressed by wars and other things that are happening. So we can't just lay it all at the feet of the El Nino, which many people want to do because they can say, well, that's an act of whoever out there, God, whoever. That's not really us that's doing anything. Well, we can't really hide behind that. And we need to take action to better understand this complicated system as we go forward. So the evolution of El Nino and La Nina are also linked to factors like what's happening in the Indian Ocean, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to really think hard about this complicated system. And it's not just a mathematical system that we need to understand, although that's very important. And maybe we need a few more steps of action. Really, that is why we're having the seminar today, this webinar. And I'm so grateful for you having me here today. And just to give an example, there's a paper. I will make these slides available. You can contact Willem Landman, but there he shows the kind of work that South Africa has been playing in researching this phenomena known as El Nino, or the Southern Oscillation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Colleen. I found it very insightful. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been seeing a lot of videos about the El Nino, and sometimes I leave feeling a bit more confused about what it actually is and what's actually happening. But I think your presentation was quite clear, and has really set a good foundation for us to understand what an El Nino is and how it affects different countries. And I think it's also just confirmed that it's real and it's something that's happening, and it will lead to more droughts in Southern Africa. And so yeah, I'm excited to
Thank you very
welcome
much.
Kao. It's a pleasure. I'm excited to welcome Kawe, who will maybe help us understand what does these droughts mean for South Africa's food systems, and what does it mean to build food sovereignty pathways, and build more resilient food systems in South Africa. Kawe, you're welcome to.
Thank you, Jess, for the lovely introduction. And then also thank you to Prof. Vogel for the amazing summary. It's also something that I took a while to wrap my head around and what it means and what it also means for food systems in South Africa. And so it's really lovely to have you here explaining it to all of us. Particularly for me as a community activist who's on the ground, having the background of the climate science is so incredibly critical. And I think all youth need to be very serious about engaging with the climate science in order for us to wrap our head around the current situation that we're dealing with. But thank you, Jess, for the introduction. Just to reiterate, my name is Kawegazi Mahlalela, and I am a community activist. I coordinate the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. And I would really love to thank for the opportunity to have this conversation, especially on Youth Day, and especially as someone who's a youth myself. And I've been reflecting on what it means to speak about climate change on a day like today, given the historical weight that this day symbolizes. Youth Day is often a moment where we look backwards and remember the courage, the imagination, and the political vision of the young people in 1976, of whose spirits we hope to imbibe within ourselves as well. Also a day that invites us to look forward and ask what kind of challenges young people are facing today and what kind of futures are being shaped by those challenges in the present. And so for many young people today, including myself, climate change has become one of the most defining realities of our lives, whether you are conscious of it or not. And this is not because it's some distant environmental issue, but because it increasingly shapes the conditions under which we live, we eat, we work, and how we imagine our future as young South Africans. And so when we start talking about the El Niño event, and we often encounter it through the language of climate science, we hear about warming oceans, disrupted weather patterns, droughts, and extreme temperatures. And these explanations and these conversations are so incredibly important as they help us understand what is happening in the atmosphere and in our oceans in a very practical way. But I think from the community activist perspective, there's also other questions worth asking, such as, what does a drought actually mean in the lived realities of our communities? What is the everyday reality of a drought? What does it mean when food prices increase faster than the household incomes? What does it mean when a family that was already struggling to buy food suddenly faces even higher costs in terms of acquiring their food? What does it also mean when a small-scale farmer loses their harvest because rains arrive late or they don't arrive at all? What does it mean for their income? What does it mean for their communities who buy their food? And across South Africa, the El Niño event has contributed to the most severe droughts in decades. Millions of hectares of crops have been damaged, and tens of millions of people across the region have been affected by hunger and water shortages as a result. And while scientists have been clear that the El Niño event is a naturally occurring climate phenomenon, climate change is intensifying its impact and making extreme weather events so much more severe. And so what concerns me as a climate activist, but also as a young South African, is that climate change is never experienced as climate change alone in isolation, but rather it's experienced through existing social realities. And in South Africa, those realities are deeply shaped by our history, as I'm sure we all know. One of the things that climate change is also revealing in the context of that is how unevenly distributed the vulnerability is across society. We do remain one of the most unequal societies in the world. Nearly a quarter of South African households report inadequate or severely inadequate access to food. At the same time, millions of young people remain excluded from meaningful economic opportunities due to our unemployment crisis. And official statistics show that youth unemployment remains above 45% among those aged between 15 and 34, while broader measures place unemployment among younger age groups even higher. So Jess mentioned this at the beginning in her intro, that Africa as a whole, but South Africa specifically, is an incredibly young population. So what does that mean for our social reproductive realities if the vast majority of the population who is young is struggling with employment? So these are not separate crises. The climate crisis, the food crisis, and the unemployment crisis increasingly reinforce each other. And this becomes particularly visible when we look at our food systems. So South Africa actually produces enough food nationally. We're a major producer of maize, fruit, wine, and many other agricultural products. Yet hunger remains very widespread at the community level, at the schooling level, university level, etc. Food moves efficiently through global supply chains and global value chains, yet millions of people still struggle to afford nutritious, culturally relevant and culturally appropriate diets. So this suggests that the challenge in South Africa in terms of the food system is not one that is simply of production. It is also a question of distribution, access, ownership, and power, and how that power is distributed. So the questions that we then ask as a campaign around the food system is: who controls our land, our water, our seeds? who captures value along the food chain, and who bears the risks when these climate shocks occur within that food chain system. And so these questions lie at the heart of food sovereignty. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, as a result, emerged as a recognition that hunger cannot be separated from these broader questions. And as reflected in the People's Food Sovereignty Act of 2024 that we developed as the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign alongside many other allies, food sovereignty isn't only concerned with ensuring that food is simply available, it is concerned with ensuring that people have meaningful access and control and autonomy over the systems that produce, distribute, and sustain the food. And so in many ways, climate change makes these questions even more urgent, because resilience isn't only about the infrastructure or lack thereof, it is also about the relationships amongst communities and their land, communities and water, communities and seeds. It's about relationships between producers and consumers, and also intergenerational relationships. How do we relearn what was lost in terms of the colonial project in South Africa, as well as apartheid in this country? And so this is where SAFC then grounds itself in a food sovereignty hub approach, and it becomes an incredibly important approach at how we try to deal with sort of the inequalities that are being exacerbated in the food system by climate shocks such as the El Niño event. So when people tend to hear the word hub, they sometimes tend to imagine it as a single project or a single garden or backyard garden or community garden. But a food sovereignty hub can be better understood as community infrastructure. It is a place where multiple forms of resilience and resistance come together alongside the food system. So a hub can include a seed bank that protects indigenous or locally adapted seeds. This becomes increasingly important as climate variability makes dependence on a narrow range of commercial seed varieties more risky. A hub may also include rainwater harvesting systems or any kind of water catchment systems like grey water systems, local water stewardship initiatives that also help communities adapt to the increasing water stress that already exists as a result of lack of state support, but then gets exacerbated by climate extremes and droughts. A hub may also include agroecological food production. So when we talk about agroecology, we're talking about using methods that improve soil health, increase biodiversity, and reduce the dependence on expensive chemical inputs that you will often see in monoculture, big industrial farms that typically tend to feed our country. A hub can also include, and very importantly, include composting and organic waste recovery systems that transform waste into fertility rather than sending it into a landfill, creating more of a waste issue. A hub also includes local food markets. These are very important. Cooperative enterprises and solidarity economy initiatives that keep value circulating within our communities, because that's what we want. We want our food system to not only feed us in terms of the food that we eat, but to also feed the economies of our communities. And so we're not competing for resources and removing the money and the wealth in our communities outside of it. A hub also importantly includes training programs, youth leadership initiatives, and spaces for intergenerational learning. This is an incredibly important part of it, right? So agroecology is something that you can learn both from a very professional trainer, but your grandmother probably also uses agroecology methods to farm her backyard garden. And so this sort of intergenerational learning, youth leadership initiatives are incredibly important. What is important about a food hub is that it's not a single component. It is an ecosystem that emerges when all of these elements are sort of connected. And the hub becomes a place where food sovereignty, climate justice, ecological restoration, community learning and leadership, and local economic development sort of reinforce each other and work together to fulfill all the gaps that currently exist in our societies, largely as a result of state failure. And so then this brings me to the question of youth and young people and what their role is in a food hub, but also in the larger food sovereignty movement. And I think one of the questions we need to ask more seriously is about climate employment, what climate employment might actually look like in the context of South Africa. So I mentioned before, unemployment is a serious issue in this country, and it's particularly impacting the youth. And too often, discussions about climate jobs focus exclusively on renewable energy infrastructure. And although these jobs are incredibly important, but they're not the whole story. They're not the beginning and end of climate employment or climate jobs. If we think carefully about food systems, there's enormous potential for climate-related livelihoods within food sovereignty systems specifically. Every food sovereignty hub, or at least the hope for it, is that it creates opportunities for seed custodians, agroecological producers, nursery managers, composting cooperatives, waste recovery cooperatives as well, water system technicians, community educators, food processors, local traders, and people to coordinate markets. And so a young person working in a seed bank is helping communities to adapt to climate change by working in that seed bank. A young person managing a composting initiative is reducing waste in their community while also rebuilding the fertility of the soil so the people who come and plant in that soil can produce really healthy, culturally appropriate food. A young person maintaining a rainwater harvesting system, for example, is strengthening local water resilience in that particular community. A young person who's coordinating local food markets is helping to shorten food supply chains and support local producers while also maintaining a local economy and building a local economy. These are all climate jobs. And it's not because they're labeled as green, but because they contribute directly to ecological stewardship, to food sovereignty, and to the resilience of a community. When we think about South Africa's future, I think perhaps we need to have a broader understanding of what the just transition means and what the youth can participate in terms of the just transition within the food system. And so a just transition is not only going to be about transitioning or shifting from coal to renewable energy, but it's also about rebuilding the systems that sustain everyday life at the community level. This includes water, food, land, care, and the way that we care for each other in communities, livelihoods, as well as our community. And so just to close, as we mark Youth Day, I find myself wondering what future generations will say about this particular moment. Will they remember this moment as a time of overlapping crises, or will they remember it as a period in which communities began experimenting with new ways of organizing food systems, economies, and relationships with the natural world? We don't know the answer, but I do know that across South Africa and the communities that we work with at SAFC, there are already communities trying to build these alternatives in very practical ways, whether they use the backyard of a school or the backyard of a church or their own personal backyards to start to grow food. They're organizing themselves in markets to sell their food. They're organizing to clean their waterways and their water systems. And perhaps that's where the hope lies in terms of the work that we need to do. And the quiet work of creating resilience and resistance, like the youth of 1976 did, could create a possibility for dignity in our food systems, but also could be a way for us to actively resist climate shocks within our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kawe, for that presentation. Yeah, it was so insightful and so inspiring. I think just as you're speaking around this food sovereignty approach, I was just thinking about how this is the alternative we need. I think Prof. Vogel spoke about resilience and adaptation, and I think this is exactly how we do it for our food systems in South Africa. And I also really love how you sort of made that practical connection in terms of how we rebuild systems and drawing the connections between unemployment and climate jobs in South Africa. And so it's encouraging to know that the pathways are there and we just need to deepen this and broaden this in our society and in our communities. And I think Charles will be helpful here. As I mentioned, Charles is part of the National Convening Committee of the Climate Justice Charter Movement. And yeah, today he'll help us explore how we rebuild systems and build a climate emergency policy platform for South Africa. Charles, you're welcome to share.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you so much, Professor Colleen, and thank you so much, Kawe, for your inputs. Perhaps to start off with a question, is South Africa prepared for a super El Nino? And if South Africa is not prepared, what does that mean in the most unequal country in the world? For the longest time, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his administration have been doing nothing but lip service when it comes to climate. You would remember South Africa's abstention on the 2026 UN General Assembly's resolution, which was engaging the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. Now, the fact that South Africa abstained from that vote made it clear that South Africa does not take the climate crisis seriously. And we must be honest and admit that the Presidential Climate Commission has not changed the fact that the government still does not take the climate crisis seriously. That advisory opinion by the ICJ, which actually was requested by the UN General Assembly, it actually framed the climate crisis as an issue of binding international legal duty, not just a policy issue. And South Africa abstained from a vote that had been endorsed by 141 countries. Now, why did they abstain? Well, because we have used coal for over 100 years. And we must be honest in admitting that actually South Africa owes a climate debt. And we are still committed to coal, we are still committed to gas too. Now, what do we need to deal with this? The super El Nino that Professor Colleen was speaking about. I think one of the most essential things is climate risk assessment and response plan. Because that is the only way we can help communities to prepare for the extreme and the rapidly changing conditions, like the droughts that are coming, the heat wave that is coming, the food, the water shortages. Because we cannot react after the fact, like we did with the Durban floods, like we did with the floods in Umtata. Preparation is key. So we need climate risk assessment and response. And there are so many tools that have been developed in South Africa. I mean, we have some of the leading climate scientists in the world. We have worked on several tools. But we need these now to be combined together so that we can prepare ahead of time, identifying the risks early, enabling action, targeting the most vulnerable areas, focusing on support to communities, reducing harm, ensuring there's limit to danger, there's limit to health, as Professor Colleen was speaking about this. We limit harm to livelihoods, to infrastructure, and we improve coordination between the local, between the provincial, between the national government, but also coordination between the different government departments, which for the longest time have been operating in silos. And we also need to strengthen our food and water sovereignty. As Kawa said, we're a net producer of food. Nonetheless, so many people are still hungry because they don't have access to that food. We produce food mainly for export. So one of the interventions that we have taken as the Climate Justice Charter movement is to call for a climate emergency social contract. We made this call even before the formulation of the government of so-called government of national unity. And what we were demanding when we made the demand for a climate emergency social contract was that, one, it has to be guided by the Climate Justice Charter and break with the business as usual thinking, be it on the economy, be it on society. Its role must be in accelerating a deep, just transition from below, led by communities. And the main objective of it must be to prepare the country for a 1.5 degree overshoot and a 3-degree scenario that comes with that. And if I may add, the super El Nino that Professor Colleen was speaking about. And it must be guided by a plurivision. That means addressing the legacies of the past, the climate crisis of today, and building a livable future, not just for humans, but for the more than human life. And it has to be driven by a climate justice systemic transformation, which actually uses the climate crisis as an entry point to deal with other climate crises. It also has to look at a current macroeconomic thinking, which moves away from the deep globalization, from the obsession with resource extraction, the new mines, coal mines that have been popping up all over the country, fracking, and of course, the move now to sort of target our oceans. And a climate emergency social contract must be based on democratic planning. It must be based on the protection of life-enabling commons, and basically based on a common systems that affirms life. And it must be based on the alternatives that Kau was talking about, like the food sovereignty alternative, rights of nature alternative, eco-mobility, protecting our water commons. And in order to do this, we cannot have universities operating with business as usual. Some of the best climate science that has been developed in South Africa is sitting at universities, inaccessible to communities. And unfortunately, universities have not taken the lead in addressing this issue, in convening society. And this is one of the reasons that the Climate Justice Charter movement launched a campaign calling for post-normal universities. We made several demands for this. And the first demand we had for Wits University was that Wits must hold a societal summit to urgently share uh, climate research from institutions like the GCI with the broader community and civil society. And that secondly, we should have support networks of students, of universities, of climate scientists in Gauteng, working with communities, working with trade unions, sharing knowledge to drive a deep just transition from below for adaptation, for mitigation, but also for the regeneration of ecosystems. And thirdly, we demanded that VETS should support the climate emergency social contract. And our fourth demand was that VETS should support the just transition away from fossil fuel summit in Colombia. We are still calling on VETS University now to support the outcomes of the Santa Marta process. And VETS must integrate climate science teaching across the disciplines to promote collaborative research, adapt its own institutions. We tried to take the petition to the university, but unfortunately, there was no one from the university to come and meet us, which again is a conviction on the part of Wits University. Post-normal universities, comrades, are critical as we deal with the issue of the climate crisis and the broader crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. Because post-normal universities move away from traditional models of teaching and research. Post-normal universities respond to complexities, they respond to uncertainties, they break the boundaries between the different departments and the different faculties. It's about post-normal science, as Funtovitz once argued. It's about building universities that work with communities, that even work with the state and policymakers, universities that work with diverse knowledge systems, universities that respect indigenous knowledge systems, and universities that don't operate in isolation. In other words, universities that remember that they are public institutions that are accountable to the people of South Africa and must be working with them. We need those institutions in order to deal not just with this El Nino, because this is one of many that will come. There will be other El Ninos that will come. If we don't build the systems now, and if we don't build the systems from below, then when the El Nino hits like it did in 2015, 2016, we'll be sitting here saying, okay, we told you so, we said so, but that's not enough. In other words, we need to build from below. And as we approach the local government elections in closing, we need to ensure that we'll take the El Nino to the ballot. If a party is campaigning in a municipality, you must ask them, what are their plans regarding the super El Nino that is approaching? What are their plans on climate? We have to take the climate issue to the ballot, be it in the provincial, local government elections, be it in the national elections. It has to be on the ballot. We cannot keep it as a side issue. Because again, the poor of the poorest again are going to be the most impacted by these climate shocks. And we have to prepare now, we have to build now, we have to build the climate justice charter movement strong in communities. That means being part of local forums. That means being part of provincial forums. That means each one of us in this meeting can do something. We can join the climate justice charter movement, be part of its climate emergency policy platform, be part of its campaigns, which are about addressing the problem, but also building regeneration, building a way out of the system. Because all of us can do something, and we can start by joining the Climate Justice Charter movement. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Charles, for that presentation. Yeah, I think that was very sobering and just a reminder of the urgency of this crisis and the reality that we can't go on with business as usual. And yeah, just a reminder of the importance of universities on a day like this, how post-normal institutions are critical in responding to these complexities using an interdisciplinary approach, working with communities and integrating diverse knowledge systems. And obviously the practicalities around what we can actually do to prepare now and build the way out as you shared. Thank you everyone for those insightful presentations. I now would like to open up the floor for anyone who might have any reflections in light of what has been shared or some questions that they'd like to ask our panelists. You can drop your question in the chat, and yeah, we'll direct them to the panelists.
Jess, I wonder while people are dropping in their questions, could I just come in for a point of clarity quickly?
You're more than welcome to, yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think what Charles said is really, really valuable. But just to say that there are some of us, when we talk about Wits University, we kind of deal with it as this place on the hill somewhere. But there are some of us in the GCR who are actively doing exactly what Charles has said. We've restructured degrees so that people can learn about climate change. We're working with local communities. We're working with the city of Johannesburg. We're helping to implement strategies and policies. So, I think just to be clear, we're trying to move in that direction, and anyone who would like to come and engage with us, our doors are always fully open, and we'd love to chat and engage more with a bigger team as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. There's a question that's just come up in the chat. Yeah, and thank you for the talk. The question is, what advice can you give youth leaders who are preparing to take action and start a project that involves a community surrounding the University of Witwatersrand?
Do you want us just to chip in, or?
Yeah, anyone
Okay.
can maybe chip in
All
for
right.
this one.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so there's a number of different things one can do. What I would suggest is making oneself familiar with already active groups who are working so that one isn't really reinventing the wheel. So just to give you a quick example, there are about 3,000 water warriors who already operate in Alex, cleaning up rivers, looking at flood controls, working with communities. We work with artists who are working with those groups as well. There's a Gauteng heat plan that's coming down the line very, very soon. Keep your eyes on that. That'll require mass mobilization around heat, etc. So, again, I'm happy to give you all my slides and also my contact details because there's a lot to join in on. I think perhaps rather than splintering efforts, it's maybe useful to, hunt in packs, if you like, so that you get more mobilization moving in a strategic kind of way. But also obviously doing our own things in our own homes, etc. But happy to help and give information. Thanks.
Thank you, Jess. Just to add on what Prof. Colin has said, yeah, I'll also be more than happy to connect together with the Gauteng-based CJCM. There are so many comrades in Gauteng that are doing amazing things, and it will be so beneficial to tap on to what they are doing so that we can scale up the work. We are not reinventing the wheel. There's amazing work that is being done on the ground, and we need to connect our energies so that we can scale up the work and take it to new levels. And Prof. Colin, I love the work that the GCI is doing. It's so exemplary. And I just hope we can scale it up across the country. And I hope that it can also inspire other universities to take similar steps and work with communities, because that's what we need to confront the crisis. Thank you.
So Charles, you'll be happy to know we are working very closely with other universities. So UCT does amazing work. Rhodes University, amazing work. Even, UJ, all across all the universities, and that's why I think shining lights on this kind of work and then, working in teams across So that's what we're trying to do. We've got interns working, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, linked to interns working in UCT. So, a lot of internal action starting to take place, not just us coming in and acting as consultants, but we're really trying to agitate inside some of these spaces. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. We have another question here, which says, what attention is there on the massive locking in of Lesotho's liquid wealth, water, by and through a contract with a US contractor for a data center establishment? This is going to have major implications for us in the SADC region, and we all need to be on top of this. I'm not sure if any of you have some thoughts or insights around that.
Thank you, Jess. Personally, I don't know about the US contractor that is operating in Lesotho, but I've been reading a lot around data centers and the impacts they have. For example, the fact that most of them operate using fresh water. And we know how our region is a water scarce region. We know how our country, for example, is an arid country. The second thing, of course, there are so many social implications of these data centers. You have people in places where immediately after a data center is established, their electricity rates, they begin going through the roof. And there have been so many concerns raised by communities from the noise that the data centers are making, but also from the fact that it's also about controlling the network and internet infrastructure. And we also need to realize that, these data centers are basically part of these technotopian networks that are controlling the global network infrastructure. But secondly, we need to look at data centers from the perspective of consumption. It doesn't matter if you have renewables, as long as we don't deal with the problem of consumption, we are not going to basically deal with the structural and underlying issue. So it's a major concern. I know it's been a concern even in Durban with planned data centers.
Thanks for that, Charles. A question for Prof. Vogel. Does El Niño just bring dry conditions, or does it also bring extreme rain events? And then the context is we work with smallholder farmers in northern KZN, and the focus in their agroecology strategies has been focused on drought resilience. But recently, with the sudden switch to extreme rain, we are now trying to work out strategies that can work both ways. Any advice?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a great question. El Niño usually is known for bringing dry conditions, particularly in the summer rainfall area. So when you talk El Niño, if that starts to click in and it compounds already, heat waves, etc., then you will get the drier conditions. But the floods that have occurred in Durban and elsewhere have been linked to what is called cut-off lows, and that really requires looking at other drivers of the atmospheric system. But to respond to your actual question, I think is the whole reason why we try and work with government on disaster risk reduction and with municipalities like eThekwini, Ekurhuleni, the city of Johannesburg, really ramping up our drought strategies and our flood risk reduction strategies. For example, I may be wrong, but the country as a whole doesn't have an existing drought strategy. The last one we did was in 2015. And so some of us are now really trying to mobilize around this. We're starting to work with other countries, BRIC countries, SALGA, the local government association is really trying to work as well with people. But you're absolutely right. We need to be flexible, and it's not just preparing for an event. And I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's not events that we should be managing for, day zero in Johannesburg. It's processes that we should be doing every single day, which are development driven, that can be ramped up when we have a drought or a flood. So in other words, expand and contract. Understanding the root causes of what are driving those situations, the economic systems, it's very complicated. But for those of us who are on the ground with these farmers, I think just working with farmers, with their local knowledge systems, with an inclusive knowledge base, we can do much, much better at that. And if we do that, I think people will be ready for whichever way, whatever name we want to give to these causes and issues. So I hope that helps. But again, I'm happy to send information or engage further. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for that. Maybe we'll just take one last question. Someone had said, I would like to know from the panelists, as a young researcher, I am concerned about the amount of wonderful research and collaboration in the academic space, along with the public, including government. Yet to date, we see little to nothing being done to improve climate change adaptation and resilience. And then they say the question is, what are we doing wrong in this context? And maybe I'll sort of tag on to that question just to give an opportunity for the panelists to give some closing remarks. In light of this question, what does a positive vision of climate justice in South Africa actually look like? Even though we see all this research that's happening, what does the move forward, what does it actually take to shift the dial around these issues?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. Lots of things can shift the dial. I think what we're doing wrong is that we still doing quite a lot of business as usual, and we need to, with urgency, start to change our outlook and actually our ways of engaging. So trying to ramp up a lot more of what we're doing in, for example, the GCI, but this requires support. It needs changing mindsets. And so we're also working on the psychology, people's behaviors. It's going to take a whole of society approach. And the quicker that we can do that, the better. To answer why it's not working, I think that's another set of lovely PhDs. There's a lot of politics, a lot of agendas that are gatekeepers that are preventing some of the stuff to move forward. But again, happy to share further on different readings, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mulweli. I share the same concern because there's so much wonderful research on climate that has been done in South Africa. We have some of the best climate science research in the world. But the problem is we have an unresponsive state. We took the charter to Parliament in 2020. We took a climate science document prepared by South Africa's leading climate scientists. But the state just refuses to listen. So that's the biggest problem. And that's why we must, in these upcoming local government elections, ensure that the climate crisis is on the ballot. We must hold local government accountable because local government is our first contact of governance. We cannot have all this wonderful climate science, but it's not being discussed in councils. It's not being discussed in provincial assemblies. It has to be. It has to be debated in parliament. It has to be debated by provincial councils. It has to be debated by municipalities so that we can put this country on a climate emergency footing, prepare for a 1.5 overshoot, prepare for a 3-degree overshoot because we're a region that is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase. And if we don't do that, unfortunately, lives are going to be lost, property is going to be destroyed, and there's going to be tremendous harm. But we can do something, we can organize, we can mobilize, and we must do so with urgency.
Hi. So I just wanted to reiterate what both Charles and Professor Vogel are saying. I think with the work that we've done with particularly young people, there is a sense of immobilization almost, and not knowing where to even start, what are the social forces at play in terms of becoming important in this conversation. And I think it really does start with firstly finding the people in the space and what social forces exist around you, whether it be at your university, whether it be at your local community, that are actually working on these issues, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Young people don't need to come up with the most revolutionary ideas, because some of these ideas are already on the ground and are already being worked on, but rather we just need mobilization. We need more bodies, and we need more young people on this, but then also engaging with sort of the material, understanding the climate science is so critical. Being able to translate the climate science in more accessible ways is so critical. And so young people, I think we just need to get on the ground. We need to do our research. We need to get on the ground. We need to find out where the social forces are and what particular impact that you as an individual can have within those spaces. Yeah, so that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for those final remarks. Yeah, I think today was a really important discussion that we've had, and will be really impactful to see what we've discussed come into action. I think it's quite clear from our discussion that climate change is not some distant environmental problem, but it is already here. It is shaping our food systems, our water systems, the livelihoods of communities, and the future that young people will inherit. But we've also heard that change is possible and that there is action that we can take. And so we need to start building new systems and prioritizing the kind of future that we want to have as society. And so for those of you who want to know how you can get involved, the Climate Justice Charter movement is here for you to participate in and get involved in building the next society from below. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign is actively working to build food sovereignty pathways. I think the idea here is that the climate crisis is also our problem, and it's ours to own the problem, but to also own the solution. And so I hope that we don't leave today feeling overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but that we're inspired by the possibility of collective action. I think change has always begun when ordinary people like us decide that the future matters enough for us to fight for it. And so, yeah, let's unite for climate justice. Thank you so much for making the time to join today's meeting. And yeah, we look forward to the next time we'll get to connect together.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank,
Goodbye.
thank you, Jess. Take care. Goodbye.